And I think open source software was this massive inspiration for me in thinking about power. What does it look like to create open source power? What does it look like to create the infrastructure for open source power, open source law? And so for me, seeing this, the beginnings of this intersection of law and technology in sort of more systemic ways through computational law, which was the field I discovered at Stanford, and then seeing that actually play out in applied ways in these explicitly open source ways with Web3 and blockchain, I think that was when I was like, this is really the coherence, the quickening. It's happening.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Tony Lai. Tony brings dynamic experiences across the academic, legal, and startup contexts. He's well connected around the world and is one of the core facilitators of the Eco-Weaving gathering at Wilbur, where we recorded many conversations in April and May of 2023. In this discussion, we get into Tony's philosophies about facilitating new types of events, ones where we can really build communities and bring our whole authentic selves. We touch on power dynamics, extitutional theory, and really where this discussion leads is to the intersection of what Tony calls computational law and ecological transition, or really where Web3 meets climate. In this space, there are new possibilities for how we encode culture, markets, and really the way that the world works. This conversation is a bit abstract and meta at times. I hope you enjoy it. Let's dive in with Tony Lai. We're here today with Tony Lai. Tony is co-steward of Mother Tree Labs. He is also a fellow at CodeX Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. Thanks for being here, Tony.
Thank you, Matthew.
And we're also here at Wilbur Hot Springs in this beautiful land. You've been one of the core facilitators of this Eco-Weaving gathering that we're attending at the moment, and that we'll be doing a series of interviews. This is our first interview. How are you feeling? And maybe we could start by, if you can share a bit about what this gathering is all about.
Thank you. I'm feeling incredibly excited about the people that we're bringing together here. Over the coming few days, we gathered together a couple of days ago, but we also had a wonderful journey, some of us, to Ecuador and the Amazon just 2-3 weeks back. And it's a continuation of that journey, as well as a couple of meetings we had here at Wilbur Hot Springs last year as well. It really is an attempt to gather together folks from our immediate community and then extended communities and people who we've really had a chance to get to know as human beings over the course of sometimes a few days, sometimes a few weeks, sometimes years, over a decade. And so having some of those deep person-to-person connections as the sort of grounding for a gathering that's thinking about this moment that we're in when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the biodiversity loss, when it comes to the destruction of the Amazon, which we saw in person together, there's a spirit that's waking up amongst people, and we're starting to see that in each other, and finding spaces like this where we can really commune as full people, not as a role, not as representing some institution, but really open up as a full living being and getting in touch with other living beings here on this beautiful land amongst nature. It's really, really special, and I'm really glad you're here. I'm really glad that we're getting these people together to think through some of what we're all called into in this moment.
Yeah, and it's my first time on the land. It's absolutely stunning to see California at this moment as well, with all the rains that have happened this year. There's like super bloom, wildflowers everywhere. Of course, there's also the amazing hot springs, and yeah, we've taken some really nice hikes. And so I want to get into some of the content of what this gathering is really all about. But first, you mentioned connecting as our whole selves and this moment that we're in. And can you share more about kind of like the approach? And I know that you've spent a lot of time with this community, really refining ideas around how do people come not just from a single organizational affiliation, but really more in that kind of communal human sense.
I think this is very much an experiment that we're playing out as a result of the ways that we've seen ourselves thrive. And I say we, the community I'm referencing is loosely the Embassy Network. It's a co-living community that I was a part of, or I am a part of. But I lived in San Francisco specifically in the context of a co-living community that allowed me to be alongside other people that I wasn't working with, but that I was incredibly inspired by as whole humans, as in people who were going about their lives with integrity, seeking right relationship. And for me to have that that sense of support, not directly, but more broadly, was the closest thing I've found to, in a sense, a chosen family. In my time, I have a beautiful, I'm blessed with a beautiful family that I was born into. And at the same time, there were certain aspects of my life choices that they weren't necessarily like 100% on board with initially. And to be able to be in a place where you feel fully seen it in the work that you're called into, in the life that you're called into living, that just seemed to open up a lot of possibility space for me as an expression of a change agent, being a change agent, being somebody who felt that they had a place to be and a calling to speak out, to express, and trying to recreate something along those lines, but with a broader set of goals, with a broader set of intentions that were aligning us, is something that then came out from I'm wondering whether to go too far into all the various different communities that of which this has sort of like flowed out and been a part of, but it's part and parcel of really what I've seen work in the world, what I've seen play out in terms of the ways in which you build trust, I guess. You build relationality, you build something sacred. And this was my own personal sense, my own personal feeling. I guess there was CodeX, which is another community I've been a part of creating, and really that camaraderie, that being there late at night, early in the mornings, but not because you had to be, but because, I mean, it was really the closest thing to just a pure passion environment, because everybody was there really, really working hard to do something that everybody thought was kind of crazy, right? When you're doing a startup, when you're doing a new nonprofit, CodeX is the Stanford Startup Accelerator. It's a nonprofit that we set up 12 to 13 years ago. Another example of this situation where just being alongside people and like rubbing shoulders with them in person, like there's something very, very fundamental about, I think, getting that sense that you're not alone, that you belong, not in a sort of cheesy way, but you belong as part of something that people have collectively stepped into and are making a commitment of support to each other in some way as people. And so I think a few times in my life I've seen the power of that versus the opposite, which is when you have a much more institutional, say, conference or event where you've got panels and then sort of like there's a hierarchy to the setup and the framework, and these structures of interaction and deliberation and coordination and ultimately collaboration and doing things together. I'm seeing in all of these different environments, these new ways of meeting and doing, which are overturning some of these embedded assumptions around what we need to be able to do our best work, do our best play, do our best creativity. And so having been in various very structured environments as well, having been a part of creating those as a lawyer, I've over the, I guess, past dozen years or so just had this new lease of life in terms of what is possible when it comes to how you help people really relate and do great things together.
And so, yeah, I think for someone listening, it might be hard to really understand some of the nuances and the subtleties of what you're describing unless they've been in these kinds of environments. But I guess I would just, at a high level, start with that. Yeah, it's a much more distinct form of, or a much different form of organizing and collaborating than going to a conference, buying tickets, showing up, sitting in an audience. There's not a lot of titling, there's not a lot of credentialing, there's not a lot of organizational logo affiliations, there's not a lot of, here are the sponsors on the wall, anything like that. It's much more about a group of peers sitting in circle, defining the agenda and the space that they want to create together and cultivate. It's about groups on messaging apps, kind of talking a bit about, what are we grabbing for groceries and who needs what at the gathering and so forth. But it's not, 6 friends who've known each other forever. I mean, there's real mass to the human scale, and there's a lot of people who are fairly new to the group and to the dynamics. Certainly myself as well, and yet it's very easeful in terms of being able to plug in. There's a feeling of warmth and acceptance, and there's still like bios shared in anticipation of the gatherings, that people have a sense of who's coming. Yeah, I mean, maybe if you can offer more examples or some of the contours of the experience, just so that we give people a sense.
Well, one thing is living together and eating together, cooking together, soaking together. I mean, we're in this beautiful environment where you have both nature and water, earth, and fire coming together in these beautiful hot springs where you sit and you open up somatically. And so this is a particular example of this kind of being alongside each other, which allows for these various different layers to emerge. I think one thing I've found in traditional structural environments is you're often very much engaging around the rational side of one's mind, and having grown up in a sort of legal tradition with a sort of a very, very structured education process. Initially, you see how that brings out a certain side of oneself. It trains that logical aspect of one's mind, and it's basically the way that most of the world is set up today. And yet, one of the really beautiful things is when you're able to bring these other layers of oneself, the emotional, the intuitive, the full human. I mean, even going so far as to say that the spiritual. There's an aspect of certainly our gathering in Ecuador, in the jungle, for example, where we were explicitly invited into a very different worldview, where we were looking at questions of money and the role of money and how it's being introduced into a worldview that hasn't really been using money for all that long, that didn't really need to use money in the same sense, where the relationality and the way of life and the modality of living and the cadence of living was drawn towards creating a sense of interrelationship and interbeing. And there were various practices, principles, and processes for carrying that out, dream ceremonies and, gathering, for community service duty and, these, sacred ceremonies around the trees where you're trying to tap into a different way of feeling and seeing. And I think that's what we're ultimately trying to do in various different ways. We're experimenting, we're opening it up to new people, more people. One of the interesting things is how we've seen in previous, residencies, gatherings, how as long as you have a large, enough people who have that sense of coherence, new people can sort of drop into that coherence. Whereas if you have too many new people, it can sort of overbias it, and you sort of get this default expectation towards a more conventional gathering where people are sort of like, oh, what do you do? Where do you work? That sort of thing. Whereas here, I mean, we're seeing questions like, what's your relationship to the land, right? How is water appearing in your life? I mean, some of these default ways of relating and introducing that we saw together in the Maori context, that this is a initial way of seeing somebody as a respected equal, and you're engaging into that, relating from the perspective of what do you care for? Like what are the things that are important to you in your wider life, and where are you coming from in terms of the responsibilities that you've been granted by others, rather than what's the role that you're playing. It's more the sort of what are all the various different things throughout your life that you care about. And when we ask people that here, we see that folks love rock climbing, folks love various different aspects of nature that you're resonating around. Folks have been activists, they've been filmmakers, they've been artists, they've been academics and technologists, and working in World Bank contexts and various institutional roles. But one of the most interesting things is when I speak to people in advance of coming to this gathering, everybody's so excited about letting go of those trappings, in a sense, and coming as oftentimes something that they've not had a chance to come as. One technologist who I've known for 3-4 years now, Dimi, he wanted to come as an artist. He says, I'll come if I can be an artist. Like, you can be whatever you want to be when you come here. Like, I want you to come as your full self. And
right.
so I think people often get pigeonholed in various different ways and different contexts. And so offering a space where you're explicitly being invited to unfurl, as it were, to borrow that sort of beautiful fern leaf analogy, but that unfurling and the origami that happens with the leaf when it sort of first comes out of the bud, and it's like, whoa, that is incredible, right? And then but before then, it's kind of like stuck inside the bud, and then we're trying to offer this space for people to really bloom, unfold, unfurl.
I love that. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that like this particular expression, this gathering, this eco-weaving gathering, is just one of many different forms and expressions across different communities you've been a part of, notably Embassy Network.
Yeah.
And it's really about finding how to create environments where our whole selves can unfurl and be seen, and that we're not necessarily stepping into rigid, hierarchical, structured, institutional forms, the way that many tech and law kinds of conferences and events and organizations operate, and that we're really trying to remember some of these other ways of being human. And it's certainly not, something new. It's very familiar in the New Zealand Aotearoa context of going to hui's, gatherings that are more traditionally hosted by Māori. It feels much more like this. And I'm sure many different cultures and contexts and professional domains around the world will be like, yeah, that's exactly what we do as well. But certainly within the Silicon Valley context, where you've spent a lot of your life, where I've spent a lot of my life, it is a bit more unique.
The Silicon Valley and the academic context.
And the academic context.
In particular, and frankly, the legal context. I mean, so these are, I guess, 3 specific institutional contexts that I've been familiar with. I kind of came up through this very belly of the beast style initiation, spent 5 years in a big London city law firm, really seeing how institutional structures played out, in so many different contexts, in government, international agreements, various different aspects of financial markets, but also the way in which the legal system itself put certain kinds of, tools and templates behind a paywall, essentially, was something that really irked me. And it ultimately was the first effort that I played out with my startup, was about trying to sort of bring down those paywalls to really open up access to justice. And I think that there was something about that was about this idea that this set of, in a sense, somewhat arcane structures of power, of naming, to go back to this idea of the power of naming, and that's of the lineage of Ursula Le Guin and then ultimately the Tao Te Ching, but like this power of naming and pointing to things and saying, this is knowledge, this is important, this must be done this way, this is the proper way of doing things. You really see how that is so tied up with who has power, who has money. And I think at the core of it, my calling from leaving the law firm to getting into startup world and the excitement of the shifting of power that I experienced through setting up a nonprofit startup accelerator and helping founders who are somehow seeking to take some embedded systemic power structure and overturn it, disrupt it in some way. I mean, that's sort of broad generalization of startups, but the idea that power was something that was closely guarded and was sort of held onto tightly by the people who already had it seemed so pervasive in so many different contexts, from both being in law and then going into Silicon Valley, because even though Silicon Valley was all about the disruption and, you know, overturning power in very different ways, it's still so tied up with power and money and the sort of in-group and the out-group. And so the one area where that wasn't necessarily the case was open source. And I think open source software was this massive inspiration for me in thinking about power. What does it look like to create open source power? What does it look like to create the infrastructure for open source power, open source law? And so for me, seeing this, the beginnings of this intersection of law and technology in sort of more systemic ways through computational law, which was the field I discovered at Stanford, and then seeing that actually play out in applied ways in these explicitly open source ways with Web3 and blockchain, I think that was when I was like, this is really the coherence, the quickening. It's happening. And I'm at this interesting situation and context where I've had these experiences of overturning power in these ways, you know, sometimes using structures and laws and, you know, working through sort of university protocol and processes at Stanford, but also really seeing the power of community and what the dynamic of bringing together a collective of people looking to overturn the Sand Hill Road sort of power dynamic, right? They were all sharing intelligence and data with each other on such a regular basis, and founders themselves really were not experiencing or enjoying that same level of collective intelligence. And so that initial group, that initial dynamic of seeking to overturn power through community and collective intelligence and open sourcing of knowledge, determining as a group what we wanted to name as the knowledge and the sort of like the dynamic amongst us, that was the first experience really for me of starting to play into, okay, what does it look like to distribute power amongst the community? What does it look like when we have these knowledge sharing frameworks that really butt up against traditional systems of power? Mm-hmm. And from there, that was a very explicit sort of play out in the Silicon Valley context. And then I think more broadly now with computational law for the ecological transition, this area that I'm looking at, and I've been researching at CodeX in the context of blockchain and the blockchain group and gathering regulators, lawyers, but also technologists, and in a sense, the full range of sociological and economic behavioral dynamics expertise that we could sort of bring under the Stanford banner. At the same time, I wanted it to be more than just what was the traditional law technology structuring dynamic. And so I think for me, this is that next evolution then, beyond just looking at, okay, there's something really interesting happening at this intersection of law and technology when it comes to power and open sourcing power, because there's potential to take what is open source software and the principles and practices around that and really layer that over this software that is also embedding code for these systems. And okay, there's a really interesting thing that can happen there, but the thing that was really going to unlock it was community. And again, you see that in open source software, but you see that it needs something way more to coordinate. It needs something more gluey, more, non-rational in some sense to actually create that community dynamic and get that baseline Kickstarter so you have the network effects to create a Wikimedia style sort of force that, takes out the Encarta. Mm-hmm. I'm starting to show my age here.
Yeah, exactly. Our same generation. Wikimedia versus Encarta.
So what I hear you saying is like the insight was that there are these other ways to really coalesce and cohere community, and that if we want to have the kind of broad scale change to the institutions of power and ways of knowing in our society, what you're recognizing is an opportunity to use these kind of collective organizing methodologies and practices. And now what you're really orienting towards is this, what you called computational law for ecological transition. And so we'd love to maybe dive in there. And did I get that broadly correct in kind of how you're thinking about, I guess, theory of change?
Yeah, 100%. So I think that encapsulates this, I guess, triumvirate of forces that I'm looking at: computation, law, and transition. And I think transition, especially from an ecological transition perspective, involves these multiple worldviews. It involves these multiple ontologies that just looking at law and technology alone, you might not appreciate. You might get stuck within the conventional Western European paradigm that is, in a sense, an inheritor of this coloniality that we've experienced over the last 500 years. And that was for me, the joy of studying history initially was getting to see this sort of long arc of belief systems as developed out by humans and how we've, looked to coordinate. And it's interesting that before around 1500, around 500 years ago, we really did see this sort of pluriverse, this polycentric cultural framework. And it was around 1500, 1492, obviously, and then and thereafter, and the sort of the papal bulls with the doctrine of discovery that just got repudiated by the Vatican, but that essentially sort of legalized the conquest and domination of various indigenous native inhabitants of lands all around the world by European settlers, and that still exists as a power dynamic, but in much more subtle, insidious ways all around the world. And so there's a global north-south debt, for example. There's still legal codes that have sort of referenced the sort of precedent of like land dominated through conquest, in upstate New York, as recently as 2006. So all of this history has sort of woven its way into our institutional systems of power, and those institutional systems are mostly manifested through law and then now technology. And I think that was the bridge that I saw going from a big law firm in the UK to Silicon Valley, is just seeing both how technology was changing things, but also how it was replicating things. It was replicating certain dynamics of power and extraction and domination. And so I think this third piece, the sociological aspect, the idea and the narrative transition, we're starting to, well, for me, it was a journey to go from understanding how law and technology is working to sort of really seeing then the need for this sociological element, this spiritual element even, of a narrative development, this idea of transition. And we've seen a lot of different sort of transition narratives in both the global north and the global south. And we've heard about Buen Vivir in the global south, and things like Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index. These are approaches which are less about growth and less about development per se, and more about good living, thriving through wholeness. The global north has its transition town initiatives, the Great Turning, Joanna Macy's work. For me, this piece is much newer for me. It's something that I think is trying to tap into something that we remember. I remember. I grew up also as part of I'd say a third culture sort of household. My parents' ancestors are originally from China. I grew up in England, born in England, but had this, I guess, outsider viewpoint of the culture in which I was being brought up, and a little bit of a bridging function to sort of traditional Chinese cultural values of mutual respect and family ties and various different things like that. But I think the real opening up for me started happening when I really got back in touch with nature. And I think that was a process for me that needed time, needed intention, needed space. And I'm grateful to those who've told me over the years, Tony, you need to go and live in the countryside for a while. You need to go be amongst nature for a while. And 5 years ago, I took that opportunity just to be more in nature. Through the pandemic, I was very fortunate to be in lockdown, but beside a forest, and got to spend every day seeing the seasons turn. And for me, that's calling in to looking at these ways of interrelating with life, these ways of seeing these different parts in myself. And again, I think this is part of this idea of layering and weaving between layers, is that if we can weave between these different layers that we see within ourselves and that we can recognize in each other. And again, goes back to this idea of bringing the whole self, like knowing that there are multiple different parts in all the people that we're speaking to, and that we can offer space for both integration or for one or the other part to come out. And sometimes you need really safe space. You need really deeper connections to be able to have that kind of space, to be able to open up and really go through some of the difficult things, the dislocation one feels. And I've certainly felt that dislocation in my time. And I think the reintegration with nature, with family, with people who one wants to be more than just acquaintances with, one wants to sort of drop in and to have the different patterns of that happen, and to start literally feeling the resonance. When one is with certain people, one is around certain beings in nature, one's body feels tangibly different. There are different vibrations happening. And I think feeling and sensing into those vibrational qualities, I mean, nothing rational explains that. Law doesn't explain it. Technology doesn't explain that. Going to the Amazon and being amongst these incredible people, this incredible diversity of life, that gives you the vibrations, that gives you this sense of, wow, this is really something. And how can we both protect this? How can we give everyone this experience? How can we help everyone feel this kind of being and wholeness and fullness? And when one isn't getting that, it turns up in like knots in the body. It turns up in terms of being with someone and feeling like you have to hold something back, feeling like you need to protect oneself in some way, versus being able to be whole and really be open to what somebody is offering, and being curious because there is that little light of some opening that you can see, and then just like double tapping on that and giving somebody the space to feel the joy of somebody else appreciating something that maybe they were just starting to open up a little bit about, because they've never felt that, people wanted to give them the time of day to talk about, I don't know, what happened to them, when they were thrown in a lake, when they were 10 or something, and therefore, they hate water as a result. And it's like, there's any number of things that we just keep buried away. And I guess I'm meandering a bit from your original question about computational law for ecological transition. But
I think my experience of you is that you do have this incredible gift at making people feel comfortable in space, and so it's helpful to hear kind of some of the thoughts that and expressions and ways that you articulate it. So I'm curious, what else are you seeing? How are you seeing this work now show up in the world around the computational law for ecological transitions?
One of the first things that we've had a chance to do here at this gathering is establish some local context, some places and projects on the ground where various different people are involved. The first is in Ecuador with the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative. On our recent journey, we were invited to a delegation of leaders who were representing indigenous nations, coming together to set up their own indigenously led entity, arrangements, working groups to be able to protect the standing forest. And this is an initiative that has come out from decades of work by NGOs on the ground, but to see it now in this process of transition to something that is indigenous-led, that can embed the worldviews and the ways of living, the ways of relating, the culture and ancestral experience and knowledge of taking care of the rainforest, being called into allyship to set something up that both allows them to preserve that, but also is viewable and tractable, tangible to the outside world, to the worlds of international finance, the worlds of international law, the worlds of relating to philanthropists and impact investors who are looking to put their money to work to provide for these global commons, and yet want to do so in an environment where they feel the resources that they're channeling are going to be put to good use. And so a lot of these ways of trying to relate to projects on the ground are contrasting to a existing dynamic which is overwhelmingly focused upon the needs of this outside world, the needs of international finance and law. And we've seen that with the carbon credits and emissions trading schemes, where you have a lot of intermediaries, you have a lot of complex legal agreements that are sort of brought to folks on the ground, and the folks on the ground kind of have very little power, negotiating position, understanding, expertise to be able to manage, what is oftentimes, a inflow of money that is being, in a sense, instrumentalizing and commoditizing the work that's being done on the ground. And I think that we're seeing with computational law the potential to both accelerate that extraction process or to try and redefine how the relating happens. And I think...
Wait, sorry to interrupt you. What is computational law? Maybe just take a step back.
Yeah, I sort of jumped straight into that. But computational law is essentially this intersection of law and code, where we're starting to see laws and rules being computationally or automatically processed in various different situations. And this has been around for some time in terms of computational contracts, algorithmic trading, even when you go to a vending machine and you sort of you put in the money and then some code operates inside the vending machine, you get that back. There's a contract happening in the vending machine. There's a series of understandings that sort of reside in statutory and common law that operate through the vending machine, through code inside. The evolution of computational law beyond these sort of specific instantiations in hardware or in, say, the stock exchange, where you have these algorithmic trading functions that are using code to rapidly, high frequency, do contractual trades. The evolution of that is with the overlay of open source. And so computational law meets open source. You essentially have blockchain and public blockchains, where these computational contracts, these computational contractual ecosystems, which are essentially multi-party stakeholder arrangements. Current analogies are, for example, the terms of service in the Amazon marketplace, or the Visa operating agreement, or any number of situations where you have multiple parties sort of contracting together in multiple different roles. Putting those now into an open source framework where those computational contracts are visible to everyone, can be interacted with by everyone, can be copied and forked into a new code base and used to support an entirely different new community, modified and remixed into the cultural and legal context of your particular situation. That's this evolution, and I'm sort of going from this sort of old school, sort of original law becoming automated, law becoming processable by computers, computational, and that in itself is exciting, because I think that opens up this possibility for agile law, adaptive law that changes based upon the outputs. Because if you have the outputs of a law being manifestly not what it was designed to do, then you should be able to review the outcomes and then have that feed into the actual lawmaking process up front and change how the law is working so that it aligns more with the original intention.
Right.
The current legal system, pre-computation, sort of relies on courts and the sort of deliberation process to make that happen. And it's slow, but it's there's a due process there, right? Certainly amongst democratic states. The idea that you can speed that process up with computation is that baseline sort of law becoming code, being tangible through data, being able to run unit tests on a contract to figure whether there's bugs, whether there's inconsistencies. I mean, as a lawyer drafting contracts and reviewing that was a dream for me. I spent so many hours doing really, really mundane stuff as a lawyer that people were paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars for my time for an hour, but it was ridiculous because so much of this could be done by technology, the tools of software coding, the libraries and the pattern languages, to borrow the Christopher Alexander term, that got adopted from architecture into software code in the 90s. That pattern language of open source libraries and being able to create something, and then for anybody in the world to be able to take that and replicate that and use that in their own context. For that to start moving into law, that's computational law, and ultimately this blockchain law and policy potential, and really bringing lawyers, bringing regulators, bringing policymakers, but also bringing community builders, bringing organizational theorists, bringing institutional leaders into this space. And then beyond institutional leaders, extitutional leaders. And this is a community leaders piece. But for so many people, they see law as this very distant, scary, expensive sort of structure. And computational law, my hope is, and especially computational law for ecological transition, which is building in this open source piece, my hope is that they'll see how tangibly tractable this is. This is all there to be played with, like Lego. Like, we get to build law. We get to build the structures that are more fair, more just for our communities to relate to each other transparently. And that possibility just isn't on the horizon, I think, of most people, because we've traditionally seen these institutions as controlled by the powerful, controlled by the elite, controlled by people who we don't necessarily have that direct relationship with. And this real opportunity to bring this whole field, this whole arcane space into like real tractability, like the hands of like people who are doing frontline work.
It sounds so scary when I think about like an Amazon marketplace terms of service.
Yes.
It's already so intimidating. Like, I don't read all those terms of service agreements that I have to click on. And now you're going to turn it to code. Like, well, I can't read all that code. Like, so how does this become more transparent, more democratic, more accessible in this shift?
So I think one part is that code is, in a sense, even if you're not necessarily able to review every single step oneself, because of the way it runs and interoperates, you can see the outputs of it quite tangibly. And also, to the extent it's open source, it can be reviewed by experts, and they will be sharing that. I mean, that often happens with terms of service and legal terms as well. Not as frequently, sadly. But I think the interesting part comes when you can compare what you basically have to abide by when it comes to the Amazon terms of service, because they have so much market power as the marketplace creator that you as a seller essentially have to abide by. Even if you didn't like what you saw there, you would kind of have to abide by it. Whereas the idea with these terms of service, if they are embedded within code and you're able to essentially take the functioning of those rules and the functioning of that software code base and wholesale, like, replicate it and the different relational dynamics into an entirely new community, entirely new situation, you could, I guess, transparently see both the laws and how they're operating and amend those to be more fair and just for the different parties within that environment. But you can also, I guess, see that playing out in the community.
Right. So can you make it even more tangible and give another example?
There's some examples of marketplace or sort of sharing economy platforms like Uber that operate quite similarly to Amazon in the sense that they're establishing this intermediary marketplace that they control. They set the terms, they set the price dynamics, and either as a driver or a rider, you kind of come in, you kind of accept what you're given. One of the examples of how computational law, this open source framework, is being ported across in that example is you're getting open source local Ubers getting set up in certain towns, and essentially the whole platform functions in the same way, and the rules and the terms operate not too dissimilarly, except people have been able to alter the key terms so that the intermediary platform isn't taking this big cut, so that the sellers, in this case the drivers, they're getting a much greater share of the ride price, but the customers, the riders themselves, are not paying as much oftentimes, and they're also knowing that they're supporting the local community and they're not necessarily supporting this sort of big, distant, extractive intermediary. I think that principle is going to play out more and more in lots of different areas. And we're looking at that in the Amazon rainforest in terms of setting up a marketplace that is owned and operated by the people on the ground, by the indigenous leaders and community members and working groups. They're learning how to deploy these computational law frameworks that are going to provide for, in their own terms, using their own indigenous legal concepts and principles, but in a way that can allow anybody across the entire alliance to see how it's operating in their interests, but is also going to allow people from the outside, international financiers, philanthropists, and others, to see that this whole marketplace, this commons, is operating fairly, transparently, with the rules and guidelines that they need to see to be able to meet their own fiduciary duties around, spending money and making sure it's not going to corruption or money laundering or other issues like that. I think these kinds of frameworks for coordination that are transparently operating, but that are operating in the interests of the parties who are involved, and it's taking out this sort of middleman, this intermediary that's thus far in a lot of these new platform dynamics and marketplaces like Amazon.com, not the rainforest, or Uber or Airbnb. Like, these are all platform dynamics where this platform has been able to accrue to itself market dominance, power, and thereby extract a larger and larger share of the value that's being brought to the table. And, again, I think the major role that they're playing is establishing this platform that has both the technology and the rules framework. And so that technology and rules framework, to make that manifestly accessible and usable by a community on the ground, and for them to be able to establish their own rules and their own market fairness practices, that's transformational. And then when you tie that to things like rights of nature, indigenous legal practices that are looking at these different kinds of ways of relating, these different ontological ways of seeing the world, ways of making sense of the world, that then becomes incredibly exciting for how we scale, how we take and replicate and have some chance at, in a sense, taking on this big inertial status quo system that, again, coming back to this extitutional idea, so many people I've met as individuals, as people, feel lost in that system, and they're looking for ways to belong in different dynamics. And it's just, this has garnered so much inertia, so much power, so much default pattern coding in our own minds, that it's going to take some explicitly designed alternate coding that makes it tangibly and visibly manifest that everybody is stepping into this alternate default, and that you can be in this alternate default. That's, I think, what it's going to take to really start helping us transition out of those narratives into these more, hopefully, thriving and wholeness generating narratives.
Right. Can you share a bit more about this word you've used, extitutional?
Yeah, so thank you. It's a word that we made up 4 years ago. We found that it already had been made up by others, as with all wonderful neologisms, but it's a play on institutions, obviously, and yet it's not defined by the word institution. Extitution, I want to cite my co-conspirators in this sort of theoretical emergence, Primavera de Filippi, Jesse Kate Shingler, and many others now who are part of this larger group, who really were looking at some of these examples of coordination relating that we'd experienced in our lives. And I've touched on community dynamics. Jesse Kate has been a sort of family member, fellow community member for many years. And she and I have both had this interest in community governance for quite some time on the sort of ground level, but then also how it plays out in various different ways. Her interest has sort of really gone into the lunar governance arena. But for me, I'm obviously coming from this ecological governance and computational law piece. Primavera was also coming from this sort of blockchain law and policy angle. But all of us were interested in looking beyond institutions, looking at what institutions miss out, looking at what are the blind spots, what are they not able to understand, what do institutions not grok, and where institutions rely upon rules and roles, and individuals are essentially viewed through the lens of what role they play. An extitution looks at the relationships and the whole person that can come into creating those kinds of multi-layered relationships. And so we were looking at the various different dynamics and communities and collectives where we've seen this happen, from Burning Man to sort of musical jams to community dynamics at the embassy. And we really wanted to understand whether there was a theoretical grounding that we could sort of pull out from various different siloed disciplines that could come into, in a sense, a theory that made sense to people, that landed with people. Again, this is all about sort of trying to put your finger or name something that maybe people are already aware of, that people are remembering in some way. But by naming something, by giving people a word to land upon, it almost justifies, it gives people a permission to be non-institutional, but to be extitutional explicitly. And so we've been playing with this for the last 3-4 years. It was funny, the first time we tried to get it out there, we created a Wikipedia article, we put it up, and the wonderful Wikipedia moderators were backing and forthing, and there were some people defending our page, and there were some people like, yeah, this clearly is a made-up word. And so it ended up getting taken down, but our mission over the last 3-4 years has been to do enough sort of institutionally credible things involving the word extitutions that it will get the Wikipedia page back. So watch this space. We've had some Harvard, Stanford conferences, we're publishing articles, we're doing all the academic-y things. And essentially this is us recognizing that we have been fortunate to be brought into this space of instrumentalizing institutions, to knowing that institutions are not there to control us, but are there for us to bring about our goals, more thriving life, more interrelationality. And institutions often lose sight of that. They get tracked into their own goals, and they become very self-serving as institutions. And so getting to give people and define out this extitutional lens, it's almost like a different plane of looking at things in a sort of three-dimensional sphere, where, again, an institution's only looking at one sort of circle within that sphere, and extitutions are looking at another slightly differently angled circle. And it's both part of the same assemblage of stuff. It's just another lens, but it's a lens that resonates in a different way with people.
Totally.
And it gives
You're
people permission.
overthrowing the power of the institutions with your words.
Trying to.
Yes.
And knowing that the power of institutions is all just created as a story. I think studying history before studying law, and then being a lawyer and seeing how it's all put together, it's like really, really going inside the mechanics, the belly of the beast, and seeing, oh, this is like the beating heart. This is the crucible of how the beast operates, and you sort of see these pieces and you come back out of it and you think, so now I have that crucible. What if I take it outside of the beast, right? And then see how that crucible might operate in these, in this jaguar, in this sort of forest jungle context, rather than this sort of like, I losing analogies for it. And I don't want to denigrate institutions either. I think institutions play and have played through history an incredible role in providing due process and fairness and a level playing field in different ways. The role of law as being this guiding guide rail for the moral arc of the universe to be sort of bending towards justice, like that idea is so powerful within the idealism of law. Right. It just gets lost once you go out and practice.
Right.
And I think that's really what I found. I needed to go in and see the practical reality and then come back out and then say, okay, there's a lot of other practical realities that we can manifest into being. And through understanding that law has its boundaries, and that lawyers, because you see everything as a nail, because you have this beautiful set of hammers, you do end up institutionalizing so many different things. And I think that legislators, policymakers, anybody who ends up in that sort of strongly institutional context has chafed against it and has sought for and wanted to find these different ways of relating. And so what's fascinating now over the last few years is just to see the practice of extitutionality in all these different contexts. And is it about like principled integrity? Like what is it, how does principled integrity manifest in in your workplace, in your life. And then when you hear about that, there's people start, talking about, getting around these strictures in various different ways. People start talking about how they leave an institution where they've been for 20, 30 years, and then suddenly they feel this new lease of life because they've got all of these relationships, but they're no longer bound by the same rules, but they can still make things happen because they still know that this person is the person to go to get this going. And so, I think there are also various different ways of negatively viewing extitutionality as well. I think corruption, nepotism, back channeling, all of these different ways that you get around and you break the rules, oftentimes that's for negative outcomes, it's for negative impulses. So again, none of this is sort of like positively or negatively valenced by default, but it's just another approach that you can come at a coordination problem from. But it's certainly one that I think has not been given enough attention, or it hasn't necessarily been given enough space by the academy and the political knowledge holders, the power holders who get to define knowledge, and through systems of knowledge. And law really is a system of knowledge of the ways of doing things, so that they become accepted within this legitimation infrastructure that we, the powerful, have set up thus far, right? And so it's interesting when you start from extitutionality and you try and create the institutions around that initially extitutional lens, you don't get as influenced by these defaults of power. And so you can say, what if we empowered women? What if we empowered youth? What if we empowered elders in a different way? What if we empowered greater participation, so that if you have a small number of people, your outcome is going to be less valid than if you have a larger, more diverse number of people? There's any number of ways that we might actually design how we want to be able to coordinate and recognize people's participation. And institutions haven't had that space to evolve and innovate for too long. But we're stepping into that time now.
Right.
Cambrian explosion.
Yeah. So it sounds like bringing it back to the triumvirate of technology and law and transition.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing from you is that this computational law framework or blockchain affords a whole new range of possibilities in terms of the transparency and the modularity and the participation in legal frameworks at kind of a communal level, at a localization level. And it's obviously within the backdrop of ecological breakdown and transition. And so for examples like, indigenous tribes in the Amazonian rainforest, where they're finding they need to interface with things like global finance to enable the protection and the sustenance of their lands, that these new technological tools, computational legal frameworks, afford a new set of possibilities, where it can become more indigenous-led and governed. The rules can be really encoded by the communities that they're meant to serve, and wrapped within this entire context is this approach of what you're describing as extitutional, and back to kind of communal and whole selves and meeting one another in recognizing all of these different layers, that is really about disrupting the current patterns of how we recognize organizational structures and ways of knowing. And yeah, I mean, it sounds somewhat chaotic and somewhat exciting and somewhat disruptive, but it's like, well, what else can we ask for in this moment in time? Like we need to have things that are disruptive and that change the current status quo if we're going to reconfigure the ways of human coordination and living in harmony on this planet. Does that resonate? My attempt to recount your words?
Hugely so. And I think there are a lot of missing pieces still. So that's why we're having this gathering, is to see what puzzle pieces different people are holding, or different people be passionate about playing out. And what does it look like to take those puzzle pieces and put them together on a collective knowledge map and build out the knowledge democracy around that. And this is like democracy in the sense that we are not the ones like sitting on high saying what is the right way to do something, what is the wrong way to do something. We're offering knowledge, and we're saying, but we need everybody to participate in the creation of this and saying what is working, what is not working, what is actually worth taking as data and turning into knowledge for our collective group, because it has been successful and used in this way to, and just to go into the specifics of it, it's to generate recognition across all of these additional layers. So just take money and currency as a baseline. And a key part of the initial, I think, gathering impetus for this eco-weaving gathering, I just want to hat tip to Kim Stanley Robinson, writing The Ministry for the Future. This time last year, we gathered with him and we unfurled what would it look like to do the different aspects of what you imagined in Ministry for the Future, because you've got all of these policymakers coming to you right now, Stan, and Stan's kind of saying, look, I'm a science fiction writer. I don't know. I imagine things, but he was like, let's gather together with people who maybe do know, or can it start imagining alongside me? And so we did that last year. And one of those pieces was a carbon coin, and this reimagining of what money could look like if it was based on the value of living nature, if it was based on the value of drawing down carbon into the ground in that situation. But we evolved that with him into this wider notion of an eco coin, not just a carbon coin, but a coin that was somehow representative of ecological and ecosystem value in a particular area, the value of a living forest rather than only after it's chopped down. So this notion of layering in value into the currency that you're using, I think this is, again, one of these, probably not immediately obvious, but one of these fundamental ways in which computational law gets brought into the picture, is because this money is not just this thing that we exchange for commodities in this new transitioned world. This transitioned world, this money layers in all of this additional information, and it's potentially relational information. It's potentially information that helps you to see that the person who's giving you this money is actually has actually contributed in these ways. They maybe planted 100 trees last week, and therefore when you receive their money, you're like, no, you get a 10% discount, you get a 20% discount. Like, this money is worth more in some way. Or and by layering in those additional sacred relationalities into exchanges and being able to make those tangibly visible, and being able to even restrict who you want to interact with based upon transparently visible conditions that your counterparty may or may not have met. But that plane of being able to really bring in your own criteria for what is right relationship interaction, I think that's really what brings power back to communities, that brings power back to people who say, I don't want to operate in this value system anymore. I want to set something up with a group of people where we can be resilient and in some sense self-sufficient, and where we are not self-sufficient, we can interoperate with the outside world, and maybe they don't care about all of this additional layered information, and that's fine. This token, this currency can also be used as a commodity, but maybe somewhere down the line somebody does take interest in this, and so that becomes a way for them to connect with us, because they see that, oh, my money is going to this project on the ground that I actually have a bit of a soul connection to as well. I'm actually interested in the artworks that are coming from this project because they can help me maintain this sort of presence with this project. And so my money isn't just going to a invisible, like, draw carbon out of the air through machines on a soap stack sort of project, but it's going to, carbon drawn down by like trees in the Amazon rainforest project. That means so much more to me, right? And so giving people that ability in the outside world to start buying themselves into the value systems of a local community, and allowing that interoperability for these little pockets of community dynamics and value systems that are in a sense exclosed. They're protected from the inside, from the outside imperializing logics of the system. So this boundary is what the computational law can provide. And so people can operate on the inside safely with their own value dynamics, with the, you've done your community service this week, therefore you're eligible to be in this buying club or whatever. And so that that's the vision, I think, for the post-transition model, where we're not all subject to these hegemonic systems that force us into Amazon Marketplace or Uber style terms of service.
Yeah, exactly. Like the money we use today is defined in large part by the monetary policy of the hegemonic institutions that are a blend of public and private, that offers very little transparency in the ways that the money is issued.
And when it is issued, I guess it goes to the people with more money first.
Right, the Cantillon effect. And those who are closest to the money printer seem to always benefit the most. And, this expression of computational law that you just described is really about, a reclaiming of monetary policy back into local or bioregional contexts. And I think it's one example, a super exciting number of examples where blockchain creates this new possibility set.
So the intersection of people who've been thinking about blockchain with people who've been thinking about evolving law, with people who've been thinking about indigenous worldviews, there's so many different really exciting areas, from monetary policy. We haven't even touched on rights of nature, and what does it look like to have some kind of computational law rights of nature framework where people can transparently interoperate as part of those dynamics, where you're in relationship with nature as well as recognizing the rights of nature in this very tangible way. I mean, there's so much open space. It's so exciting to be at this intersection right now and meeting all of these people and meeting more and more people who are, in a sense, going on this learning journey together. And I love the way that you put it the other day, is that this is, in a sense, a journey of governance, a journey of understanding and learning governance and unpacking what governance is and what it means. And for it not to be this thing that's associated just with government, but something that really is associated with your own empowerment, your own participation, your own community. I think that's, and seeing where our defaults have led us down these sort of narrow paths that we can sort of step back from and like re-understand what does it mean to like be in this beautiful space of seeing someone as a whole person rather than as just some instrumentalized portal to some commodity.
Right.
And yeah, it's to be reminded of that over and over again just keeps one humble. And to have people who help us catch our blind spots around us, who we trust deeply and we feel able to be vulnerable with,
right,
is priceless.
Right. Yeah. So if someone's listening to this and they want to get more involved in this world, they want to organize their own gathering or event, they want to make a change and step more into some sort of extitutional forms, like offer some guidance, some advice on how people can, you're so deeply embedded within these communities and with all of these different layered ideas, but someone that's maybe newer to the space, what would you say?
Well, I would definitely check out what we're going to be releasing off the back of this gathering. The idea is that we are evolving an open learning community that is a knowledge democracy where everybody's invited to participate. So we'll be doing our best to be learning out loud, and you can go to mothertreelabs.com. It's an early initiative that we've been very, very lucky that the Biome Trust and others have come to give us this space to emerge this out. What does eco-weaving mean? What does it mean to bring extitutionality to the space of computational law for ecological transition? What does it mean to bring filmmaking and storytelling? And this is the work of my co-steward, Susanna, who is in itself this really, really interesting lens to be able to hold space for. Is like, what does it mean to draw out people's different stories? What does it mean to overlay stories and narratives and with creativity, with sensitivity? That's very much Susanna's wheelhouse. And between us, we've been trying to create this space for learning together. So I invite everybody to come to mothertreelabs.com, where we'll be opening this out. Other places to check out, of course, some of the other folks who are here at the gathering, the work of Regen Network, work of the HyperCerts team, the Biome Trust work. There's I think various different threads that are being woven here. Everybody's holding a different piece of the thread. But again, the hope is that once the tapestry has been woven once, it doesn't need to be woven again and again and again. We can just like take the pattern for the tapestry and offer it. And, that pattern integrity should hopefully hold.
Beautiful. Well, I so appreciate being invited into this space with you, Tony. It's an incredible, potent gathering. I'm super excited to have many conversations here. And yeah, any final words or reflections from you?
I just want to express a deep gratitude to you and to all of our whānau in Aotearoa for welcoming Susanna and I into that space, to understanding, again, a whole new worldview, a whole new way of connecting to the land, to connecting to music. I want to encourage us all to listen to the music of the land in the way that you invited me to be able to do. And it's exciting to see the symphonies starting to emerge from all the music as people start discovering their voices. So I would encourage everyone to find their voice as well.
Tony Lai, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Tony Lai. To learn more, go to mothertreelabs.com. And for other conversations that we had at the Eco-Weaving Gathering, check out maearth.com. I'll see you on the next one.